Test 1, 2. Good morning. Welcome to Asia House. I'm Michael Lawrence. At today's conference, Digital Fragmentation, we are producing, in partnership with Accenture, we're going to explore some very thorny issues facing businesses. The impact of new regulatory structures and protectionist measures on the digital world, that is, digital fragmentation, poses new challenges for business. Where the internet was once an open space with the free flow of data and information, new barriers, new uncertainties are emerging. China's cybersecurity law and the forthcoming EU General Data Protection Regulation, to name just two. In fact, according to Accenture, some 200 new protectionist measures have been introduced in 31 countries between 2014 and 2016. That's just one measure of the change of the environment. And today we are launching Accenture's report, Digital Fragmentation, Adapt to Succeed in a Fragmented World. We'll get a detailed briefing on the findings of the report a little later in the session, and it will inform much of our discussion throughout the morning. It's clear from the report that businesses need to adjust their global IT architectures and their plans for growth and innovation in this increasingly complex digital reality. Dialogue with policymakers is essential to craft a policy framework that manages new risks, but also allows innovation and trade to thrive. And we'll be joined today by two policymakers, along with a number of leading experts, to drill deeper into the issues of digital fragmentation and how business needs to navigate them. Now, in a moment, I'll invite to the podium Matt Hancock, UK Minister of State for Digital, to deliver this morning's keynote address. He's also agreed to do a Q&A on stage and to invite your questions, which is great. Thank you very much, Minister. Now, that will be followed by a briefing from Accenture on its report, which, as I said earlier, is being launched today. It's a fascinating and important piece of work, and one which will form the basis of today's discussions, but I think much more going forward. After the break, we'll be joined by the Minister of Digital Economy and Society from Thailand. The Minister is on his way from the airport now. He'll be here shortly, we hope. He'll make a keynote address, and he too has agreed to take questions from the floor. That will be followed by a panel discussion where, as I said, we're going to drill deeper into some of these issues and give real practical insight into how business can adapt and thrive in this challenging new digital environment. And today's event is being streamed live on the Asia House YouTube channel and on Facebook. Now, please join me in welcoming to the podium UK Minister of State for Digital, Matt Hancock.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and I think it's an incredibly important and valuable time to be having this discussion. And if I may, I was attracted to your invitation for two reasons. The first thing, it was spectacularly flattering, and you should never underestimate the importance of being nice to people. The second is because I think that this conference puts the finger on something which I'd been worrying about and interested in, especially from the point of view of being a UK policymaker. And so I wanted to come in order to try to work through my own thoughts on this question, but also I hope have a rich conversation in which we can work it through. Because, of course, it's commonplace now to say that we're living through this time of enormous transformation. 10 years ago, the smartphone was yet to be invented, and is now fully embedded in our lives. And for a whole generation, this change is accelerating. Indeed, I like to say that this is likely to be the slowest pace of change that we'll live through for the rest of our lives, because the nature of the technology is accelerating the change. And yet, I think that there is a bigger philosophical change that is taking place as the internet matures, and we think about that from a UK perspective, but also from a global perspective. And this conference consciously asks us to think about the consequences for the interactions between countries, as well as from the point of view of an individual nation state. And it comes down to this. The digital revolution brings huge opportunities and also brings challenges for businesses, for individuals, and for countries. And I believe that it's the responsibility of government to maximise the opportunities and to mitigate the potential risks. Now, we do that best, especially in this area, through collaboration. If we tried in government to get the answers right, we would fail. We need to do it through collaboration with civil society, with industry, with academia. And when I say industry, both wider business, but also, crucially, the global platforms, because it is only working with and through them that we can really execute policy. And the nub of the issue is this. When the internet was invented, there was a presumption, and I think at the start it was a fair presumption, that the increased connectivity between people would be an unalloyed good. That if you put more people more easily connected to each other, then they would improve not only economies, but also essentially the well-being of people right around the world. And boy, have we seen that in action. You know, from being able to Skype your grandmother on the other side of the world through to being able to start up a business in Cornwall and immediately trade globally with the over 3 billion people who are on the internet, especially with the explosion through the smartphone of connectivity, which has brought countries around the world, accelerated them into the global economy, and in so doing, attached them to the free market economy that is the single engine, biggest engine for prosperity and against poverty that the world has ever invented. So there is this enormous upside. But this presumption, this essentially libertarian presumption, that you would end up with transcending states around the world and the connections of individuals would all be an unalloyed good, has now to be tempered. And even the greatest enthusiast for digital technologies like me, I mean, Christ, I'm the UK's first ever Minister for Digital. I worked in the tech industry before I went into politics. You don't get more pro-digital than me. But all of us need to recognise that there are risks and harms that are also accelerated because of this connectivity that we must be cognizant of and that we have a duty to take care of as a state. There is a role for the state in ensuring that the harms online do not get out of hand and undo the great benefits of the internet. And I think of it this way. Fortunately, in the offline world, we've spent several hundred years developing how to balance this need for responsibility with the ability to give individuals the greatest possible freedom. There's a whole subject on it. It's called political philosophy. And ultimately, we need to move from a libertarian approach to the internet to liberal values, where we support individuals' freedom whilst also ensuring that that freedom does not trample the freedom of others. And that then brings me to these questions of what, as you call it at this, you discuss at this conference, a splintering, because the truth is this: the approach that we take online should be the same in principle as the approach that we take offline. For instance, crime that's committed online is a crime just like a crime that's committed offline. However, there is a big challenge in delivering on those principles, even if the principles are the same, because of the global nature of the net. And since politics is unable, and in my view is rightly done at a national level and unable to be done in its entirety at a global level, inevitably the different cultures and mores of a national body politic is then transferred to some effect online. And one person's balkanization of the internet is another person's expression of national values. So let me give you an example. And I hope that this example also points to one of the potential solutions, which I'm going to come on to. Last year, I took through a bill in the UK Parliament, the Digital Economy Act, which included measures to ensure that people under the age of 18 cannot see adult content online. This is a classic mitigation of a harm brought through the internet. Because in the offline world, access to pornography for under 18s is difficult. Not totally impossible, but difficult. In the online world, it was exceptionally easy. And despite the efforts of some of the major platforms, some of which are completely porn-free, it is very straightforward, and the harms of this are clear and well evidenced. In so doing, in bringing age verification into the access to pornographic sites, we are now seeking, in the period of implementation, before it comes into force in April, to make sure, to as much an extent as possible, that the porn sites do not just bring in age verification in the UK, although we will require them to do so, but also do that around the world. Now, some will and some won't. But I think this is a good example of how the UK body politic asserted its right to require a protection of children, which is something that happens in the offline world. We assert it in the online world, but there is a potential solution which is better than simply one that is only in place in the UK. Another even better example is how we deal with piracy online. The major platforms and the major search engines agreed in January this year to remove and downgrade links to sites that provided access to music and film content that was illegal because of its failure to respect intellectual property rights. Now, we did this in the end without statute, without legislation. And the consequence of that was that we succeeded in persuading the major search engines to change their algorithms to downgrade links to these illegal sites all the way around the world, therefore protecting, from my point of view, protecting UK music wherever it was listened to around the world, and for the global music industry's point of view, ensuring that those who produce content are appropriately rewarded for it. Now, here was an example of government action using our convening power without legislative action, successfully persuading the major platforms that they had a duty to act within a set of norms which include the protection, in as much as is reasonable, of people's intellectual property. This has been a very successful agreement. It has reduced the problem very significantly, and it's also done it in a way that is global and allows the continued operation of those search engines on a global basis rather than territorially. I think it's a really good example of how we can proceed. Now, you mentioned in your introduction a couple of very specific areas. Firstly, the importance of the free flow of data, and secondly, increasing numbers of protectionist and territorial rules. It is interesting that in both of these rely on good data protection standards. I think there is an opportunity for a global, an increasingly global agreement on the free flow of data where there is good data protection and where there is good cybersecurity. So we have, there's a good reason that we have a free flow of data rules with countries that are deemed adequate in terms of data protection. And that is that we do not want free flow of data where there is not that protection of people's privacy. That is a democratic choice legitimately expressed through the governments of democratic countries. And the EU rules on this, the GDPR, are in fact extraterritorial. So will in the end be global, because any country that wants to, any company that wants to trade, or any entity that wants to do business with EU citizens based in the EU will have to abide by these principles anyway. So I think that in that area, far from there being protectionist measures, I think that there is the gradual growth of an agreement that increasingly could onboard other countries to ensure the free flow of data under a set of rules that protect people's rights. And in cybersecurity, we have a similar corollary. But ultimately, to forge a global consensus will require the ability of that global consensus to reflect national values also. There is a value to global solutions, but ultimately our task and our job is to ensure that the great power of the internet, that the great new technologies of our age can be hewn to the benefit of humankind. It is no smaller task than that. There are technologies in their infancy now which will change the way that we live forever. And ensuring that we don't just ask the question, can we develop these technologies, but we also ask the question, how must we develop these technologies for the good of mankind? That is the job that we have to achieve. And we can only achieve it if we work in collaboration with our partners and friends around the world, in governments and in wider society, to forge a strong agreement on how we can achieve this, whilst also reflecting the legitimate and reasonable considerations of the people who we serve. It's a big task, but I think it's an exciting one, and I look forward very much to working with you to help deliver it. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you very much indeed. Lots to digest there. Can I start on your thinking on a global consensus? A laudable goal, but how can that possibly achieve? What's the forum in which this discussion takes place? Who takes the lead? Which country takes the lead? Is it really a feasible goal?
Well, I don't think that it can be done through the formal mechanisms of a single global institution. I don't think that's the way that we should think about this. But there is a very important role for leadership. We try to provide some policy and intellectual leadership in this space. Others also do. And I think that we work our way through it through the practical implementation of individual policies. Now, some of these areas, at a highly technical level, some of these things are, of course, subject to global organizations. For instance, ICANN and the discussions around the technical underpinnings of the web, and that's very important. And it's very important that that is done in a multi-stakeholder fashion. But I don't really think that that's where the heat in the debate is. They're the important infrastructure underpinnings, and they must remain free and open. What really matters is content and what happens online. Yes. And there, I tried to provide a couple of examples of where where leadership can help to get us to a position that improves the use of the internet globally. I'll give you another example. We're very concerned to ensure that the development of AI and other big data technologies are done in a way that is not just legal, but also ethical. And there are decisions that will be made explicit by the use of AI in decision making that are currently implicit and made by humans and have been done by humans for since time immemorial, and are now suddenly having to be made explicitly. If you think about some of the decisions implicit in some of the algorithms, for instance, in autonomous vehicles. And having non-statutory but clearly thought out, relatively consensus-based standards for how an algorithm might approach a challenge like that, I think is very important. The route to finding as much glue around a particular standard starts with thinking about it and writing it down, and then onboarding a coalition of the willing.
Where does digital fragmentation, the splintering, the regulatory challenges, where does that rate in terms of priorities for UK government? Given there's quite a lot happening in UK government at the moment, we've got a minority government with Brexit negotiations, is it on the agenda?
Oh, very much so. I mean, there's one thing bigger than Brexit, and that's the technology revolution. So, other people can deal with the small stuff. So yes, it's very much on the agenda, and trying to find a way through. Because if you think about it, to be more sort of acute about what I try to articulate, we are both responding to national pressures as democratic politicians. These changes on pornography that I was talking about, actually, the enforcement mechanism of ISP blocking was not our original intention. That was put into the bill by Parliament because the very strong pressure of Parliament was to strengthen the enforcement mechanism. So, in a democratic country, it's very important to, in fact, in all countries, I'd argue, it's very important to respond to concerns like that. But in so doing, I'd rather that wasn't a national solution. I'd rather that was a global solution, as we have in other areas.
Okay. Open it up to questions from the audience. Please, if you wish to ask a question, put your hand in the air. We'll bring a microphone around to you. Lots of issues to cover. First question, please. Richard.
It's Richard Cumming from Linklaters. Matt, one of the characteristics of the EU's framework on this is a fundamental right to privacy. You think the UK needs to build its own fundamental right to privacy as we leave the Union?
Well, the fundamental right is embedded in the GDPR. It's very important that we bring the GDPR into UK law, both in order to ensure that we have a high-quality future agreement, adequacy or stronger with the European Union, and also because the GDPR is extraterritorial anyway, and the vast majority of exporting companies in the UK export to the EU, the downsides to it are very, very small. And so there was a live debate on this, as you may know, on Monday this week. A clumsy attempt to bring constitutional language from the EU into primary legislation would actually have had exactly the opposite impact to that which was intended, not least because GDPR already reflects the Article 8 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is the privacy article, and indeed the recitals around GDPR make that clear. So no doubt we'll return to this one, but we have a right to privacy in the UK. It is tempered by certain exemptions. Attempting to have the right without the exemptions would lead to all sorts of problems, and so that's the approach we're taking.
Okay, just behind.
Thank you, Minister. Edward Lewin from Hewlett-Packard Enterprise. Two-part question, if I may. Applaud your work on getting major platforms to remove or downgrade on the piracy music sites. But coming back to something you said earlier about how new technologies are being developed all the time, and we may not even know what the next big platform is in 3-4 years' time. How do you keep a framework of acceptability for this country without legislation, and how do you keep a nimble legislative framework to account for what those new technologies are? And then the second question is, sorry to come on to the small stuff, but are you concerned, you talked about Britain's influence on some of the big global issues like free flow of data. Are you concerned that we lose some of that influence when we're no longer part of the world's biggest economy?
So on the first question, we've got to make sure that the regulatory system is as nimble as possible too, and whether that's through non-legislative action that we take, where we've got to make sure that we're up to speed with what's going on in government. That means it means a different culture in government, being much more open and listening to what's happening, and asking where the problems are, but also taking a different approach in terms of regulators. I cite the FCA's regulatory sandbox as a really good example of keeping up to speed with technology. Essentially what they say is they have an API with companies that register to say we want to do fintech innovation. The deal is you tell the FCA what you're up to, you have an open book approach, they have the presumption in favour of you getting on with it, and if they have a problem they'll come and talk to you, and on a no regrets basis. And that regulatory sandbox is now being copied both around the world and also by other regulators in the UK. So that's my answer to the first question, since you were so cheeky as to ask two. I'm not sure that we particularly lose influence in terms of the global debate here. We hope to continue to be engaged with the EU debate. In fact, in our proposals on data that we put forward in the summer, we set out that not only do we want a deal at least as good as adequacy in terms of free flow and unhindered flow of data, but also we want continued engagement at a technical level between the regulators. But ultimately, this isn't just an EU issue, this is a global issue. And whether that's leadership in the G7, there's discussion at this at the Commonwealth, because most of this is about coalitions of the willing. There's unfortunate precedences to that phrase, but
yes.
no, I'll think of a
context.
Yes, because most of this is about countries moving together in partnership. You have to use all the different multilateral organisations, and I think that anyway it's about ensuring that, as I said, you get that best possible global reach and the advantages that brings, whilst also being cognizant of and reflecting the local nuances.
We had a question down here. Yes, this lady there, please.
Good morning, Minister. Helen Swift from Airbus Commercial Aircraft. Digitisation is one of the highest priorities of our organisation, and it is seen as the tool to improve our competitiveness and most important, productivity.
Yeah.
We really welcome the publishment of the Jürgen Mayer Industrial Digitisation Review on Monday, particularly the recommendations around encouraging organisations to invest in Industry 4 technologies, and also for knocking down the barriers that have been identified around connectivity and digital skills. My question is, how has that landed in government? What is your view on the recommendations? Is it too early? And most importantly, how will the recommendations be taken forward with regards to funding lines to support in that?
Well, we're very enthusiastic about the work that Jürgen's done. The digitisation of wider industry is one of the 7 pillars of the digital strategy. It's one of the hardest actually to prosecute, because it's about encouraging businesses to use modern technology to benefit their businesses, which is something that government can't do alone. The support for stronger digital connectivity and certainly the skills piece, which are chapters 1 and 2 of the digital strategy, that's a direction I wholly concur with. There's a lot of work going into that. We already have a 1.1 billion future budget in this space, but crucially, actually, both connectivity and skills is really about ensuring that there's proper structures for private sector involvement, because it's not something that taxpayers can shoulder the burden of alone.
What's the risk that new regulations, not just in the UK, but in national governments, by national governments globally,
Yeah.
will thwart slow innovation. Are you aware of that risk? Do you believe there is?
Yeah, of course. Yeah. No, of course I'm aware of the risk. I think it's the task of those who are putting forward regulatory structures to ensure that they are supportive of innovation, like the sandbox, but also more broadly that they're designed in such a way as they actively encourage innovation. You know, we in a free-for-all, non-regulated environment, you do get some amazing innovations, but actually sometimes a framework is very important. Take what we're putting in place at the moment for autonomous vehicles and drones, currently going through Parliament, which is about putting in place a regulatory structure in which innovation can be actively encouraged. So there's a job to do to make sure that we have agile regulation.
Okay, we've got time for one more question from the audience, please. So.
Thank you. Robert Gardner, DRD Partnership. Matt, you talked about protecting under 18-year-olds from access to pornography, but I'd be interested in your view and indeed any updates on progress of protecting under 18-year-olds from their behaviour that is reported online when they are older. So this notion of right to forget.
Yes.
And whether you think that's a good thing and how far we are down that line.
Yes. Well, the Data Protection Bill currently before the House of Lords contains the provisions to do that. That was a manifesto commitment to the right to be. It's a part of the right to be forgotten, which is within GDPR. Specifically to allow people to request their details be removed at the age of 18 from social media sites. As the father of an 11-year-old daughter, I feel the necessity for this area of policy and to get it right urgently before she gets seriously online.
It's good that you're motivated for all sorts of reasons.
Certainly, yeah. Get on with it.
Oh, that's the spirit. So I'm afraid we have to leave it there because we have much to get through. Thank you very much for joining us. Really good for you to take questions indeed. Do come back because this is an issue which isn't going to go away and it's obviously going to become more complex. And certainly we're very keen to follow it and track it. So please, ladies and gentlemen, thank
you,
Hancock. Let's now move on to Accenture's report. As I said, it's a great piece of work and we want to hear more about it. Digital fragmentation, adapt to succeed in a fragmented world. Please welcome to the podium Omar Abosh, who's Chief Strategy Officer with Accenture.
Good morning, everyone. Great to be here with you today. And fascinating to hear the Minister speak there. I'm going to, I think, stay on the same topic, but look at it a little bit through a business lens. And as Michael just said, I'm Accenture's Chief Strategy Officer, which means I'm on our Global Executive Committee and responsible for the direction of the company and all of our investments. And to give you a little bit of a flavor, we're a 430,000 person company now, operating in more than 100 countries with offices in more than 50-something countries. So we look at this topic at a very personal level for our business as well, to understand. So by way of setting a little bit of context, the outside world, I think, we talk about a low growth environment in the OECD countries. And you'll hear people talk about globalization 2.0 or even deglobalization. And that's a little bit some of the context that surrounds us. And indeed, if you look at some of the stats, global trade in goods between 2003 and 2007 grew by 7%. In the last year, 2016, it grew by 1.3%. The equivalent figure for services, global trade in services, was 0.1% growth. Those are pretty low levels of growth. And foreign direct investment has still not yet recovered to the levels of pre-crisis that we saw. So that's investment flows between countries. Now, does it matter? I mean, you could say, look, we're in the second longest bull run ever, or pretty much since the Great Recession in the 1930s, the Depression. But actually, we think it does matter. And it matters for several reasons. One is, if you look at the OECD data on the share of global trade in GDP, if that grows by 1%, then that drops through to between a 0.9 and a 3% growth in income levels of people. And of course, it impacts the poorest people the most. And it's probably not an accident that the number of people in poverty since 1990 to now has been halved to below now a billion people in the world, at exactly the moment that the world's poorest countries opened up their economies to be on a more open trade type stance than they had been in the past. And of course, China is the exemplar on this, with 680 million people taken out of poverty since 1990. And so we think that this topic here around what's going on around globalization 2.0, or whatever you want to call it, really does matter. From the Accenture point of view, we serve multinational companies, and we're a big company ourselves, and we serve multinational companies, and we look at the world of business and global trade and how it operates, underpinned by a digital fabric that allows trade to actually happen with data flows and the movement of services and products in the IT sphere that enable much of what we talk about in the global economy. And what we have found is a couple of trends that I'd like to sort of focus in on here. So the first one that we've talked about here is around, well, what are governments actually doing? And so in the G20 countries, since 2010 to 2016, we've seen a quadrupling in measures that restrict trade. A quadrupling. So now there are 1,200 measures from the G20 countries that restrict trade. Now, national legislations, and I think the Minister spoke extremely eloquently around the democratic legitimacy of choices that countries make, grapple with tough issues like terrorism, cybercrime, inequality in the economy. Those are very legitimate issues that they grapple with. But I think sometimes it worries us when we look at the specific policies being put out there, not just the Chinese cybersecurity law, Michael, that you referred to, is that those policies sometimes seem to get jumbled up a little bit with identity politics and populist politics. And so they sort of take it in the same breath. And what we've seen here is an increase in the share of populist parties in Europe. It has doubled since the 1960s. And the number of seats in the European Parliament have gone from 3.8 to 12.8% in recent times of the seats given to populist parties. And so that's something to think about. So this is, if you like, the trend in the macro context. But on the flip side, and the Minister again spoke about this, is we have the world of these giant digital platforms, Facebook with 2 billion consumers, WeChat in China with billions of consumers, conducting commerce at a level that never ever seen before. And you'll hear about web scale and hyperscale and infinite scale, and these services that provide incredible convenience to consumers. And indeed they've created tremendous consumer utility that consumers jump on. The reason Amazon is successful is not just because Jeff Bezos is brilliant, which he is, but because they've created something that's so convenient and helpful for people, and people vote for it, they like it. And so you have these two trends, one around this sort of fragmentation of politics perhaps, and the other one around these big massive data flows underpinning the digital platforms that we see underpinning big chunks of the economy. When certain heads of state talk about the bull market and how fantastic the growth in the share prices are underpinned by earnings, what they don't often tell you is that those earnings have mainly come in a fairly concentrated a small number of massive digital companies that have driven a lot of the effects that we see. So what we see here is a collision actually between two different trends. You have, and these trends are led by sets of people who speak completely different languages. So you have the world of politicians and people designing frameworks for markets, and then you have the folks who are generally coming from a software engineering background, building these digital platforms, speaking really in quite a different language. And so, we heard about the libertarian view of the internet, which certainly is on the right-hand side, and then perhaps, how we inject liberal values in the internet, although that, of course, is coming from a UK minister, and I wouldn't assume for one second that would be the position of many other governments around the world in terms of how they think they want their internet or their version of the internet to be. So, as I said at the beginning, Accenture's perspective on this is coming at it from the world of business and saying, well, what really is going on here? So we went and spoke to a group of people in business. We spoke to 400 CIOs and CTOs of big corporations who, of course, they're not just the big digital platforms, although those companies are in there, but I'm talking about the wider companies in the global economy from 8 different countries. So, of course, you'd expect the US, the UK, Japan, China, South Korea, Germany, so big countries. And those are the folks that we spoke to say, okay, what are you seeing? Like, what are you already seeing as a result of, let me call it this economic nationalism or some of these deglobalization policies? And what they're seeing is 88% confirm that this fragmentation is actually a problem for their company over the next 3 years. They perceive it as a problem. 86% feel that their existing IT strategies, their IT systems architectures are not fit for purpose, perhaps, for this new environment and are vulnerable. 91% predict an increase in IT costs overall. They're going to have to pay more to operate and run the IT that they need to serve their company. And of course, that shows up in the form of access to talent, where you get your data center capability from. Those things look like they're going to be costing them more. And 2/3 of the companies are already feeling those increased costs. So that's already in the economic system today. The statistic I think that surprised me the most was that 74% stated explicitly that they would expect to exit or delay or abandon a new market entry as a result of this fragmentation. And in the UK, the number is 84%. As a sidebar, pretty much all the numbers I quoted you, the UK equivalent number was higher as a percentage. And so what does that mean? Well, if strategic trade has contributed to increases in wealth, particularly for poorer people, then this probably matters. And again, I'll point you at a report that I thought was very interesting from Ray Dalio, the head of Bridgewater, the other day, about the inequality effects. Because, I mean, of course, as someone who sits there thinking about what is the effect of digital on the economy, you have to answer the question about inequality. And what you'll find is that there's a huge polarization between the top 40% and the bottom 60% of people. And the issue is when you pump more cash into the top 40%, or essentially when you put more money with richer people, they don't necessarily spend more because they have a lot already. When you put a little incremental money to poorer people, they immediately spend more on precisely the goods that drive global trade. And that's an interesting insight to think about for policymakers as they think about policies that affect how business works. So what are we actually seeing then beyond this? So these data flows are underpinning a whole range of engines of growth in the economy. And the minister alluded to some of them. The Internet of Things means that you can connect devices and offer new services. Cloud services means that you can access services remotely from anywhere at a very low cost. In fact, you can access innovation that billions have been spent on by a Google or a Facebook, and you can access it super cheaply off a cloud service, no matter if you're a tiny startup or an independent entrepreneur. The world of analytics and personalization, again, could be used for an amazing force for good, of tailoring services to a way that people really want, that suits what they actually desire and need, rather than, the broad brush. I don't know how many of you remember, but marketing leaflets stuffed in the mail, arriving in your home, randomly. That world is completely changing. So these tools of the modern era are very valuable, but they're underpinned by data flows, and those data flows are being disrupted today. There are obstacles arising for them. And so, when we ask these CIOs and CTOs to say, what does this make you think about your digital strategy, what you're doing in your company, what we found is that 54% that using cloud services was becoming harder. That's 62% in the UK. 54% said that using cross-border analytics services was also becoming harder, and that's 70% in the UK. And that digital transformation, which again is a little bit, I find a funny phrase, but essentially what does it mean? It means, how do I deliver incredible business results in an era that is digital? How do I do that? How do I use digital techniques and methods and innovation to improve my company, improve my services? Again, a large portion are saying that they see that is getting harder in the world of regulations and rules and obstacles that they face, that they have to deal with today. And again, when you look inside the company, what struck me a little bit were the statistics that they were quoting about which functions in the companies are most impacted by these rules today. So sales and marketing, research and development are the most impacted groups within companies today, which of course think about where a lot of innovation needs to come from. But I was also surprised that even manufacturing was up there as one of the functions that would be most heavily impacted. Now, of course, companies don't stand still. They get on and they do things, and in fact, they already are. And so one of the things that we see companies do is resort to the use of automation of work. Now, it is ironic that oftentimes legislation that's designed for job protection stimulates accelerated job automation. And that is indeed what we've seen over a long period of time in the manufacturing sector. What a lot of these modern IT technologies enable is the same effects to happen in the white-collar types of roles and jobs as well. So companies, when they're finding it hard to ship talent around, sometimes resort to making that need go away through the use of automation. And that is two-thirds of companies overall said that they were down that road, 76% of companies in the UK. Just over 50% already restructuring their global IT architectures, so their data centers, where they put, where the data residency is, and how they manage that. And that's 62% of companies in the UK. 20% of the companies said they've already had this subject, a whole board meeting focused on this subject. So that means at the highest level of their business, they're very fixated on this. And 80% of the companies said they've had several strategic planning sessions on this already. So I've painted a world where you have these two big trends, if you like, that bump into one another. Companies are already moving and doing things. But what is it that we think that they really are likely to need to do going forward? And we boil it down to four topics. So the first one is the strategy process itself. Actually, I've always been a little bit bemused at how the investment community, until relatively recently, and I really mean in the last 3 or 4 years, the investment community has never really looked at technology as a major factor in deciding about an investment. The private equity community right now are now making it a prerequisite. Like, what is the impact of technology on this company? Because people now really see that this digital effects are pervasive. They affect basically every single sector. But I think companies need to go from, how will technology affect the company to how will the rules about technology affect the company. That is a piece of the strategic planning process that needs to be adjusted. And of course, it will affect things like CapEx plans that companies make, the ventures and acquisitions that they would strike, and phasing and prioritizations of moves that a company makes on its digital journey. How will that evolve over time? So that's the part one here, is around how do I have agility baked into my strategic planning process. The second one is around local advantage. And for anyone here in the room who grew up in the resources industries, you're very familiar with the concept of local content. That, of course, applies here as well. To drive digital innovation in a company, to take advantage of digital, you have to work with an ecosystem. No one company has the monopoly on innovation. You have to work with an ecosystem of partnerships, big and small, local partnerships, local technology players, local digital players, as part of a company strategy, we think will become ever more important. Plugging into, most of our clients, big companies, they do work with local regulators and local policymakers, but the degree to which they work on things like the National Innovation Program of a country, I think there's a lot more that companies can do in that space, and I think we'll see a lot more of that. And again, when people talk about the big bad multinationals, of course, and I'm speaking very personally as an Accenture, which is a multinational company. Accenture India has more than 100,000 people, and our Accenture India leadership and the Accenture India folks are just as Indian as any local Indian technology company. And I think a job of every multinational is to be local where it resides in its individual countries. The third part is a little bit around actually understanding the data flows that are driving management and decision-making and management investment decisions, and understanding how confidentiality rules and residency rules are going to affect those data flows. And actually, that's not so simple as it sounds, because you have to think forward in terms of what's the data I'm going to use in the future to improve my business. And if you look at the signal hubs that companies are creating today to build up incredible predictive insight into what consumers want and need in near real time, that is a major data flow exercise. And so understanding those data flows and then de-risking them, and working to understand which policy rules are most impactful and how to manage with that will become a key part of risk assessment and risk monitoring, or enterprise risk in the business going forward. And then the fourth one here is, of course, technology itself offers some of the solutions. And so I mentioned automation and augmentation of the workforce using artificial intelligence techniques. Those are for sure part of the story. Cloud services, of course, are part of the story. Much innovation that's happening today is being baked either through open source or proprietary techniques into the cloud stacks. And companies, one of the success factors of companies in the future will be their ability to use and leverage that. Other things like blockchain and 3D printing are in the same zone. Just because I have to keep the manufacturing blueprints in one place doesn't mean I can't manufacture it somewhere else. And those are all parts of, I think, how this story will evolve. So, in summary, digital and the innovation that goes with it underpins growth in the global economy. So therefore, digital fragmentation is a big deal, and it's actually already happening. This is not a theoretical thing. Well, the evidence is it's already happening today. It is indeed impeding on innovation and growth in the economy. When I talk to my clients in business, of course, we ask them to make sure they think about these things and prepare their companies as best as they can. But from a policymaker's point of view, of course, there could be advantage in designing rules that advantage your local corporations and help them in terms of taking advantage of these digital data flows and the innovation. So that's actually all I had, Michael, in terms of prepared comments. I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on this. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. A great piece of work. Some fascinating things that come out of that. I want to touch on one of the numbers first. The 74% of respondents who said they were going to exit or delay a market. That's quite an alarming number, isn't it?
It is a big number. Of course, it's very hard to know, what the control experiment is.
Yeah.
But it was very much asked in the context of these trends. And I think this is not a secret, but when there is uncertainty in the world, business delays decisions. That's how that's as a business leader, that's what you have to do. If you're unsure if a move is a good move, then you don't make it. And unfortunately, delaying decisions means delaying investment, and delaying investment means delaying growth. And so, yes, I think it is alarming.
You mentioned a bit later on about de-risking data, and again, that's interesting because it's not just looking at legislation that's coming down the road, it's also looking at consumer trends and how one might inform regulation before it's put in place or adapt your business model to it. How does business go about that? Where does it sit? Does it sit in CIO? Does it sit in legal?
I think this one is a difficult question, and actually a challenge that I give a lot of my clients is, if you look at boards of companies, they're composed of people primarily from a financial background. Their obligation is fiduciary and very careful financial steering of a company. The problem with this whole digital thing is it turns out that technology is a really big deal, and not a lot of very technology literate people sitting on boards, let alone something deep like cybersecurity.
Yeah.
And so actually the answer is you need more senior technologists in boards. Involved in helping steer organizations. I don't think the answer is immediately jump to CIOs, because if you ask yourself, what have we asked CIOs to do in the last 20 years? The answer is cut costs. Offshore, outsource, cut costs. And so actually they've become more, there's a broad brush, that you often end up with a contract management logic to the CIO function rather than a technologist and what can technology do for the business logic. Although that, of course, is the amazing opportunity for CIOs today.
My experience in the past, especially with Reuters and Thomson Reuters, where technology was a key part of the business, one of the challenges was getting the technologists to understand the business, because pure technology is a beautiful thing, but doesn't necessarily apply to consumer trends or, in particular, complex legal environments. So is there a piece of work to be done there as well?
No doubt. What you made me think about, Michael, when you said that is, if you think about all the small companies that are busy disrupting industry after industry, and it's in every sector, it's not just fintech, it's health tech, it's ed tech, it's insure tech, that's out there. The way they do it is they start actually with a business issue, a customer pain point that they understand deeply, and then they say, how can I use all this modern technology to solve that problem? That exactly, of course, is the logic that corporations need to also use. And so I think that would encourage more technologist-minded people to say, actually, what are the business issues I'm trying to solve and deal with? And that I can use technology for.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Very happy to bring in the audience now, please. Immediately. First question over there. If we could take the mic around to the gentleman in the check shirt. We'll come down there.
Hi, it's Tim Rush, KPMG. Probably just following on your one about de-risking data. Do you think there's going to be slightly self-regulation? In the past, it's been every single company have gathered every single data possible on people. But what they're now struggling, especially the banks, is how do I use this properly because they've got too much data? Isn't it going to be a stage where people are going to get much more refined data of what they need, and therefore with the GDPR and everything else, there's going to be an element of self-regulation because you're not going to have so much?
I think that's a very tough question. If you think about the behavior of companies, they come across a broad spectrum, often reflecting the culture of the leadership, the founders, and so on. So you have, if you go to the West Coast in the States, you'll find companies there who are much, much more fearful about their competition than they are about regulators and politicians. And that can drive their behaviors. But then I can find you other examples of companies who are much more concerned with the impact of a public revulsion to some acts of misuse of data. And so the maturity around a code of business ethics in companies is not a consistent thing. How to handle data responsibly is not, I think, something that you can have a blanket rule that says it applies equally everywhere. Now, the banks obviously have been bashed very heavily since the financial crisis. They've spent a fortune on compliance, tens of thousands of people in one bank with a job around compliance. And so that mindset could become much more pervasive, but that isn't necessarily true in any number of other businesses I could refer to. So I think you're going to see a full spectrum there.
Okay. There's a question down there, just at the back. Please, Tiara.
Hi, Omar. I'm Sri Kumar from ArcelorMittal. So you talked about the ecosystem and platforms for big companies to thrive in this digital disruption. And you also mentioned that the smaller companies who are coming up with solving particular problem, they will play a big role in the ecosystem. So how a large organization can build this partnership with these smaller companies? I mean, of course, we are seeing nowadays some of this like GE or Saudi Aramco, they are also starting up their own venture capital firm to, let's say, promote this type of companies, but not everybody is doing that. So what's the approach big companies should take, basically?
So now you're talking about my day job. So I'm obsessed with that question because I really mean what I said, is innovation comes from the bottom of a technology maturity S-curve, not the top. Corporates all inhabit the top because our cost of capital is too low to afford the risks of failure that you get with innovation. So all the innovation is actually happening at the bottom of the S-curve. The problem is corporates are pretty useless at working with small companies because the CEO goes to Silicon Valley on a digital safari, meets a company and goes, wow, you're brilliant, then asks the CPO to go and do something with them, and the chief procurement officer takes 60 days to sign a non-disclosure agreement, by which time the company's dead. So figuring out that match is a non-trivial thing. And as you say, there are all sorts of experiments out there. There are corporate incubators, corporate VCs, corporate accelerators. Generally, they don't work that well. There are a couple of examples. So what do we think? I think multiple things have to happen for companies to succeed. One is you need to accept, and corporations are not good at this, that you're not good at everything. Corporations find it very difficult to, you've got to get rid of the not invented here syndrome. And so that means buying little companies and not killing them. And letting them teach you and letting their culture infuse you. That means developing a gene for partnering, which again, big companies were like, I'm the big company, you're going to follow my rules. Well, maybe. But that's probably not the best way to get the best insights and the best innovation. And then thirdly, in Accenture, we talk about an innovation architecture, which is how do you create units or organizational nodes in the business who are investing at appropriate levels for the market maturity of a given innovation. So if the thing might be 10 years out, then invest little. If the thing is 3 years out, then invest more. And if the thing is at scale today, then invest masses. And how you design that in the architecture of the company is, I think, a very interesting thing to do.
Yeah, we've seen many examples of big companies taking over small innovative companies and just squeezing the innovation out of them because they have to comply with all the internal rules.
There are tons of examples. I mean, not only in the tech space. If you look at how the oil majors handled fracking in the US. They often went and bought fracking experts and then made no money. And the reason is they brought their financial policy, their HR policy, their compliance rules, and imposed them on these small companies which were not designed, it was not fit for purpose for that market. And so how to adjust is not trivial.
Yeah. Next question from the audience, please. I'd like to turn now to the regulatory environment. Do businesses accept there's a need for regulation to catch up with technology?
I think all businesses accept that a free-for-all market is probably not wise. In fact, every market is circumscribed by some rules, and so therefore regulation is necessary, yes. The issue is in human history, and I don't see this changing at all, is the regulation will always lag the technology.
Yes.
And so how you manage that latency in time is not trivial.
Did you get a sense from, not just from this survey, but from your clients, that business is as engaged as it should be with policymakers to have input into regulation?
Again, to the gentleman's question over here, I mean, I do think that is on a spectrum of industries. Like, so the financial services sectors, post what happened in 2008, have been super involved. in shaping policy, you know, whether you like it or not, in countries around the world. The technology giants on the right-hand side of my picture here probably didn't grow up with that same heritage and mindset, and in fact, until relatively recently, they've been very popular with consumers, and therefore politicians not that interested.
Yeah.
There's a risk right now for them, I think a very real and present danger, is that they've suddenly become less popular and have to show up a lot more. And if you look at the lobbying expenditure of the 4 biggest digital companies in Washington, D.C. in the last year or two, you'll find that it's at the top of the league table in terms of, you know, being more connected with what's going on Capitol Hill.
Are you optimistic, though, that businesses can navigate this path? Because the transformation of technology itself over the last decade or more has been extraordinary. And some businesses have succeeded, some haven't. Are they better prepared? Can they navigate it?
I mean, I'm convinced the answer is yes. I think businesses obviously just have to remember the basic mantra of, you know, what's the public good here? What's the public interest case? What's the public interest case that we can be part of? And of course, as long as businesses are doing things that are good for consumers, then it's good. And if they're doing things that bring investment, bring innovation, and drive growth, then there is a public interest case. And so I think businesses just need to be much more explicit about the things that can augment that public interest case versus detract from it, and make that part of their day job. And I do think that most mature businesses see that as the way to go here. And of course, there is a win-win for, you know, policymakers that create a vibrant business environment will attract more investment and more growth, which of course is good for their citizens. And so,
thank you very much. We have to leave it there because we're going to take a break. Fantastic piece of work, really is fascinating. Some of those numbers, I do advise you to have a look at it. I believe it's going to trigger much more discussion going forward. So please, ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking Amar Abash.
thank you.
We're going to take a break now for about 20 minutes. We're back at 11. Thailand's digital minister will be here then. He'll make a speech, he'll take some questions, and then we'll have a panel discussion with some experts to go into some of these issues in more detail. So thanks very much. See you back here at 11. Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to today's Asia House Conference on Digital Fragmentation, which we are producing in partnership with Accenture. Well, we heard earlier about the likely impact on businesses of new regulatory and other measures in the digital world. It's clear that dialogue with policymakers is essential to ensure that regulation manages risk, but it also allows for trade and innovation. Thailand has launched an ambitious digital program. It aspires to make the country the digital hub of Southeast Asia. It is part of the wider Thailand 4.0 initiative, which aims to transform the economy through technical innovation and through infrastructure. Well, we are delighted, very pleased, in fact honoured to be joined this morning by Dr. Pichit Durongkovorot, Thailand's Minister for Digital Economy and Society, who's flown in just this morning to speak with us. Dr. Pichit, please welcome to Asia House.
Thank you, Michael, and very good morning to you all, members of Asia House and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. Even though I just got off from the plane, but I'm very ready because I see this as a very good opportunity to inform you of the excitement that we are feeling in Thailand at this juncture of some may call it leapfrogging development. And within the past 1 or 2 years, we have seen some very good examples of how we can proceed without avoiding the disruption that is going through the whole world today. And as a matter of fact, we are welcoming disruption so that the society and the economic development will be able to be propelled by good new regulatory regimes as well as development which is somewhat different from the past pattern. I'm given about 20 minutes. In fact, I have about a few hours to deliver to you. But let me say this. For the past year and a half, the government of Thailand has put in a new framework called Thailand 4.0 that Michael has mentioned. In brief, it reflects 3 pillars of development that we try to realize it. The first pillar is to try to make Thailand getting into innovation, okay? And you know full well how extensive that kind of work is. Secondly, we have learned in the past that purely economic development can be dangerous. So our second pillar is to make sure that social disparity is reduced as much as possible. And that also reflects to the third pillar that we are aiming at whatever we do, sustainable development. Okay, so these 3 principles have been the guiding light for Thailand. Now, as I mentioned very briefly to Michael, if you talk about Thailand 4.0, you also need to talk about the mega project that has been going on for the past year, and that is the Eastern Economic Corridor, or EEC, covering 3 provinces on the eastern part of the country. This is where the excitement in terms of Thailand 4.0 in real term. And for example, the new 3rd international airport at Utapao, the newly renovated deep sea port, again, same place at Utapao. The rail link, which is not only EEC, but will be covering the whole of Thailand, led by the current link from Bangkok to Nong Khai, which is the northeastern part, at the border with the Lao PDR. And if you look further north, you see the future rail link of China, especially from southern China through Thailand. And if I'm not wrong, in the future, it will be down to Malaysia. So you see a different kind of landscape in terms of transportation, in terms of cargo, in terms of passengers in the future. Together with that rail investment, which will be billions and billions, there will also be a number of high-speed trains. The most recent plan is for high-speed train that can capture the passengers that we already have today. For example, from Bangkok to Chonburi, Hua Hin, which is the resort town, and from Bangkok to Rayong, which is not only resort but also manufacturing on the eastern part. In the future again, we are going to see the east-west corridor as well. The first one is more of a north-south corridor, which also will have a line to Chiang Mai. For the east-west part, we are talking about linking the eastern part to the western part at a province called Kanchanaburi through Bangkok. And Kanchanaburi is where we can enter into our neighboring country, that is Myanmar, which if we will be able to go through to the seaport of Myanmar, we will be able to deliver things to the Indian Ocean and beyond. Okay, so this is just example, but I don't have much time for EEC. So let me get right into digital. The ministry that I'm handling at the moment is brand new. It just started early this year through a new legislative act. Even though a lot of assets have been passed through from the original ICT ministry. Anyway, what we are planning to do today, let me give you 5 or 6 examples of the things we are doing. The first one, in Thai we call it Net Pracharat. Basically, it's the village internet scheme. I've been wrestling with this project since early this year. The idea is, if you want to get into innovation, if you want to reduce disparity, you need to give your people access. And in telecommunication term, there are 3 A's. And I'm trying to realize the 3 A's. Not in 10 years, but within this year and next year. The first A is availability. Second is accessibility. But with these 2, if you don't have affordability, people still cannot connect. I'm talking about internet. I'm talking about fiber optics. In the past, we have about some 30,000 villages that have some kind of internet access. Okay? We still have much more to do. This year alone, my ministry is installing fiber optics to 24,700 villages. And at first, in the beginning, I thought it's going to be very, very painful, very difficult. So far, we have installed 20,000 villages within 4 months. Okay, there are many reasons why we could achieve that. So by the end of this year, we are going to be able to install 24,700, no problem. Okay, the rest, about 18,000, will be handled next year. So by the end of next year, Thailand, the whole of Thailand would go broadband. And I'm talking about broadband for the villages, for the remote areas, for the farmers also. So this is the first time that we can see equity. This is the first time that we're not going to be bothered by digital divide anymore. Okay. Now this is the superhighway. At the international level, our countries know full well that we need submarine cable. Okay. Now Thailand is in this Southeast Asian region, and we need to do more in terms of linking the global submarine cable to this ASEAN or Southeast Asia. So just to give you one example, recently we have just completed one connectivity with our friends, 18 countries altogether, called AAE1, Asia, Africa, Europe 1, linking from Europe, pass through Middle East, Africa, Indian Ocean, to the left-hand side of the southern part of Thailand, a province called Satun. But in the past, we'll have to go through the Malacca Channel down south, another 1,000 kilometers. But this time, there's some innovation happen, and that is we create this digital bridge, land bridge, from this province called Satun to Songkhla province on the other side of the map. Okay, and from Songkhla now there's a line through Hong Kong. So we are linking the whole world, and it's now operating. This is just another example. My third example with regard to infrastructure is smart cities. Okay, we have experimented with Phuket Island for the past 2 years. Very, very successful. We have free Wi-Fi in public space for tourists. We have CCTVs for security reasons. We have wristband so that when people cross to another small islands, they can be traced if something happens. So all this is happening rather quickly. This year and next year, we are planning for 5 more cities, 3 of which is the EEC provinces. The other is Chiang Mai and Khon Kaen. And they can be smart differently. So this is another kind of infrastructure that if we can be successful with these 6 provinces being smart next year, and all the provincial governors come to look at this. In Thailand, we have 77 provinces. Guess what? Our governors would want their province to be smart. So I would bet in 5 years, the whole of Thailand will get into this smart city concept naturally. Okay? So I'll just give you these 3 as example of digital infrastructure. E-government. E-government is quite important. The fact that it's not only for trade, for facilitation, but also for public services. Yesterday, the World Bank has just announced the ranking of countries, 190 countries throughout the world, on the ability for ease of doing business. Thailand jumped from position number 46 to 26 as a matter of 1 year. Okay? And very difficult. Let me tell you, very difficult. Digital play a big part because through digital policy, government, especially agencies that mostly or naturally resist change, right? Change very quickly because it's a top-down policy. They need to change. And it's not only individual agency anymore. It's the integration of agencies that has to provide facilitating convenience to business to do their jobs. Okay? So this has been quite an achievement, but we'll do more. Okay? We also have a number of initiatives today, also very difficult, especially big data scheme, data center for public or for government agencies, as well as cloud computing services for the public at the moment. A lot of them is the public-private joint venture initiatives in order to make government data useful not only for government administration but also for business to be able to use data for their data analytics and data utilization for their business ventures. Let me also say that in Thailand today, we understand full well that there are some worries going on with regard to regulation. In the past, we have completed a number of regulations relevant to digital. And soon we will have the complete set, okay? By the middle of next year, we should be able to finish. The last one would be Data Protection and Privacy Act, so that business will feel relaxed in terms of using data, especially when it deals with the people's data. Okay? We also have most recently cybercrime, cyber security act, so that as we know, and UK got to feel it more than Thailand with regard to WannaCry, the ransomware. Okay, so with this piece of legislation, we'll be able to make sure that the society will be protected, especially the critical information infrastructure. Okay. And last but not least, we have also the computer crime law in order to protect, misbehavior as well as false information in the net. All this is to protect the society, to protect the business. Nothing to do with wanting data from the citizens. Okay? In fact, in the reverse, we are protecting data of the citizen. We have to do more on the human resource side, and this is where I think UK and Thailand can collaborate. We need digital workforce, a lot more of them. My plan is to make sure that we have 500,000 digital workforce in 5 years. Okay? We cannot do this alone. And now we have many measures in order to facilitate investment as well as human resource development. For example, in the EEC area is maximum investment privileges. In the past, they used to offer something like 8 years of tax exemption. Now it's 8 plus 5. In the past, you can rent the land for a short period of years. Now it's 50 years lease. Okay, something that the business can have more predictability on their ventures. We also have expanded our startups and entrepreneurs in a big way. Starting from last year, now we are talking about 500 mostly young startups spreading everywhere, not only in Bangkok. I'm amazed every time I go to Chiang Mai or Khon Kaen to see co-working space, a lot of coffee shops, of course, as well as maker space. And last year, we put up a large amount of money in order to get the universities up and running on providing entrepreneurship program, as well as to provide ecosystem for their students on campus to do more in terms of knowing how to earn money, even when they're still on campus. Okay, I would predict that they'll be richer than the professors very soon. Let me conclude, because I'm taking a lot of your time, by saying that I insist that to me this is an exciting time, and it's the time that the government are fully aware of the needs of the private sector, the needs of the business, as reflected by this World Bank ranking. Okay, and again, anything that we can do in order to make your life easier when you want to invest, not only in EEC, but throughout Thailand. Incentives. For those of you who are doing business that has research, for example, we are providing 300% tax deduction for the research expenditures that you use in the country. We also have agencies that will handle according to your need of personnel and of staff, because we fully understand that today is a battle for talents all over the world, and we are trying our best in order to facilitate the manpower part for your business. And last but not least, we are not doing Thailand 4.0 just for Thailand. Frankly, we also want to see the prosperity of our neighboring countries as well, inclusive of Laos PDR, Cambodia, Myanmar, and Vietnam, and hopefully the whole of ASEAN. And if the Prime Minister always say that don't leave anyone behind, if we can prosper together, Thailand is in a good shape. And especially geographically, we understand full well the power of China today, the Japanese investment, as well as the Korean. But let me stop by saying that I also realize very well that there are a lot of United Kingdom's investment in Thailand. And let me know what we can do in order to work together, in order to increase the level of investment. Just yesterday, we are talking with the board investment about how to assist a company called Senior Aerospace Thailand, doing high-end precision technology for Airbus and for Boeing in the engine blades, aero engine blades, for example. So this is going on, and we certainly can discuss about the targets. For example, the 5+5 target industries that we are aiming at the moment, inclusive of the extension of the existing industries such as automotive industry, whereby Thailand has a lot of manufacturing facilities of all over the world, including the food for the future, whereby we still have a lot of agriculture in Thailand. But we want to move on to value addition food rather than just agriculture. And with digital, smart farmers, smart farming can certainly assist. And also with the new S-curve, the so-called new S-curve, and that is the new industries that we want to move forward, including the aerospace, robotics, medical, digital, of course, as well as biofuels and biochemicals. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attention, and let me know if the Thai government can assist you in any way so that your business and business partnership can grow. And let's make it happen soon, because digital cannot wait. Thank you very much.
Minister, thank you very much. Clearly, great ambitions for transformation of Thailand, and particularly in the digital space. May I start with regulation? You talked about new regulation that's coming down the line in Thailand. How does that compare with international regulation or regulation in other countries? Is Thailand aiming to be very tough on issues like data protection, or is it looking at a more liberal environment?
Well, first of all, in principle, our regulations, whichever piece that we talk about, we always look at benchmarking with international benchmark, sometimes with OECD, sometimes with EU or many other countries, and especially so that we have the ASEAN alignment. For example, lately we have this ASEAN regulator meeting, okay, to align ourselves so that we can do things that can be acceptable intra-ASEAN as well as inter-ASEAN. Secondly, we are not a closed country. In fact, the Thai society is very open to the outside world. Today we have, for example, the mobile phone penetration of 150%. So one person owns more than one, We have internet penetration of about 50%, which still needs to increase. But the meaning is that the Thai population is now exposed to the outside world in a big way, okay? So for the government to do anything, we also need to be very careful, of not only try to help them in promoting their local business, for example, the village internet, for example. We are not going to just construct the broadband. At the moment, we are planning on 3 items. 1 is e-commerce, 2 is e-health, and 3 is e-services and e-learning, okay? So with these, the citizens, and not only in Bangkok anymore, okay, will be able to understand the value of information and the value of digital technology. And they will naturally wants their privacy, wants their data to be protected. This we understand very well. And that's why the legislation that we enact is basically wanting to do this.
You mentioned, though, e-government and having a system whereby business can access government data to encourage business, to encourage commerce. How will that work, and how does one regulate that? Because it sounds enormously complex.
Well, for example, we have just completed one scheme whereby if a businessman wants to set up a restaurant, okay, and we have gone through the whole loop of processing of paperwork and about 6 ministries that they have to walk to. And the folder of the application forms is like this, okay? Now it has been ironed out and it's one-stop service on the net.
Yeah.
The point is not to bother the business people as well as the citizens to have to submit the same forms 5 or 6 times. That's the job of the government, of the backdoor operation. We are certainly doing exactly that. And with this one-stop service scheme, more and more setups will be completed one by one.
But will you allow other businesses to have access to some of that data? Do you have a regulatory environment? For instance, a supplier to a restaurant, a food manufacturer, shipping, chairs, laundry, whatever. Will they be able to see new restaurant applications and use that data to help form their businesses?
Well, certainly in principle, I think Thailand is no different from other countries. We have public information. We have information that do not violate the personal data. And we have security type of information. Certainly, we can do a lot more on the first part, and that is public information. Okay, it's not that we have, since in the past data collection still not so tidy.
Yes.
Okay, but with the electronic means today and with the government policy on digital e-government, now it's coming into places, and this will be released more and more to the public, which also include the business as well. But it must be level playing field.
Yes.
Okay, not to provide exclusive to certain entity.
Okay, let's open it up now to the audience. Please, if you would like to ask the Minister a question, put your hand in the air. I'll send around someone with a microphone. I'd like to ask the first question. Please. It's on.
It is on. Paul Scully, I'm the new Prime Minister's Trade Envoy for Thailand. I'm looking forward to coming to Bangkok next week. Just a very basic question, actually. You talked about rolling out broadband to the villages, and that's fantastic news. What sort of speeds are you looking at achieving in those areas?
Thank you. At this point, every village will be provided one free Wi-Fi, so that villagers can make use. Okay, and it's 30 megabit per second downlink and 10 megabits per second uplink. Is that high speed enough? That's very good. Okay. Moreover, the free Wi-Fi is to set example so that villagers start to understand how valuable that is. Okay. We are now getting requests from villagers. When can I enjoy my household Wi-Fi? At what cost? So this is the thinking, and we are implementing it very soon. In cities such as Bangkok, you have this amount of pricing, okay, where Bangkokians will buy. Okay. In villages, from public policy point of view, we say don't use that pricing. You have to give them some handicaps. Otherwise, it beats the purpose of affordability. So now we are talking to ISPs on how they can reduce the margin, the profit margin, but in return, they have the volume. Because we are talking about 75,000 villages, much more than they used to. Okay? So with this, we'll be able to advance the digital penetration to the remote areas, because they will be able to enjoy pricing where they can afford. And as I mentioned, the e-payment, e-marketplace, e-logistic can happen very, very fast. And we have experimented in many villages. Telemedicine, it works wonderfully. And it helps, lives and healthcare service. In Thailand, we have health volunteers at the village level. And I just learned from the Ministry of Public Health that today we have more than 1 million volunteers. And they have been working for the past few decades. The idea is now to equip them with digital technology. So we are going to have the e-health volunteers in the near future. And they'll do preventive medicine, and they'll do primary care. So this is the power of technology that we should be able to deploy as quickly as possible without having to reinvent anything.
Okay, thank you. Next question, please. Catherine.
Thank you very much, Minister. Catherine Clark from Prudential. So I'm interested in what your government is doing with existing players in Thailand to help, especially in the financial services space, in reaching more customers. Financial inclusion is obviously a key point of your government on the finance ministry point of view. So I'd just like to know how you're working with big companies that are already there in this space.
First of all, we have a number of initiatives on promoting fintech, and the Bank of Thailand at the moment has the so-called fintech sandbox scheme, so that new innovation on financial transaction or financial arrangement can be handled even though it does not comply 100% with the existing regulation, but they can do it for the first time, maybe with some constraints or with some time limitation. So this has been going on for 1 year already. Okay. The Ministry of Finance is also, together with the Ministry of Digital Economy, going to work on the so-called digital identity scheme to enable the business to be able to do more efficient transactions and with a very healthy identifying the customers. Okay? And this will take about half a year because we have to do it very carefully in not bothering the person, the applicants, in whatever they want to do, to be identified through this EID scheme or digital ID scheme, which has the guarantee of the security, which has the guarantee of private data, and which will make it quicker for decision making in your transaction. So this is going to happen in half a year. The Ministry of Finance also very interested in SMEs, and they are trying to locate where SME can be helped, because SME is also very important, especially in supply chain to the bigger companies. And there are many schemes at the moment, including the grant, in order to help them equip more and better technology, as well as to make sure that the streamline of the supply chain will be more efficient. And last but not least, we also look into how to help the poor portion of the society. Okay? Just a few months ago, we have asked those who think that they are poor, register with us. Thailand has about 67 million people. Okay? 14 million registered. Okay, but we're not so sure. That person may be poor, but the spouse may be very rich, for example. So I asked my National Statistical Office to go and do a nationwide survey and to find out, okay? So the number reduced. But the message that I want to get through is that once we have that kind of data, we can help the poor more effectively. Not only ad hoc or one shot, but in the long run. And we also ask them, apart from cash, what do you need? And this is very important because in the end, we don't want to give them cash. We want to give them something so that they can help themselves in the future. Some of them are SMEs. Some of them are village shops. Okay? So now we have better and better pictures of how to cope with the reducing poverty in the country. And this is just one example of how we can engage digital technology as well as the data and information to go through this data analysis and data analytics so that we can do better work. And I'm sure that it will have a very good effect on the business cycle as well.
We're just about out of time. Is there one more question on there? There, sorry.
Thank you, Minister, for a very interesting speech. I come from a small country called Estonia, and we're very proud of our e-solutions and different e-initiatives. I was wondering, have you heard about the concept of e-residencies? So essentially it is that allows foreigners to sign yourself up and apply for an e-residency, and that allows you to open up businesses very easily. And so my question would be, do you know about it? And if yes, then do you have any internal discussions about applying this or similar something to this in Thailand as well?
By the way, in 2 weeks, I'll be in Estonia for the Global Entrepreneurship Network event. We're not as good as you, certainly, because you are more advanced. But starting from early next year, we are going to have a scheme called Smart Visa. And Smart Visa is very meaningful for the expats who are working in Thailand today because it's too clumsy in terms of having to report themselves, having to get in and out. So Smart Visa would refer to those foreign workers in Thailand that can stay as long as 4 years plus, okay? And having to some kind of reporting themselves only once a year. And this will be inclusive of their family members as well. So this is just the first step, but we are heading toward that direction as well.
Final question, Minister, before we wrap up. What engagement do you have with businesses, especially global business, multinational businesses, in particular about regulatory changes that you're looking at? Is there a forum, is there an active discussion, or are you pushing ahead based on discussion with other governments?
And I have to limit myself to digital issues.
Yes.
Okay. In all the legislation pieces that we are introduced to the Parliament, we sit down and talk with business partners and to see where their concerns are. And then we discuss on how to conclude. This has been a normal practice. And according to the Constitution, and this is even bigger, in every piece of legislation, we have to have a public hearing. Okay? Sometimes it's a physical hearing like this. Sometimes it's through the internet. Okay? So this has been a normal practice today. And there are also associations, for example, the Joint Chamber of Commerce, who has been very active, and we have meetings to discuss about this. Certainly, we have differences, I must admit, but it's something that we have to work together because, after all, we are going to be in the same environment.
Okay. Mr. McFerry, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much for your time. Thanks for jetting in for this conference.
You're welcome.
You have clearly a very ambitious program. I wish you the best of luck. And the Minister has invited businesses to get in touch because you're keen to encourage investment, international investment, especially in this space. Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Dr. Michelle. Again, Minister, thank you very much. Very kind of you to join us today. It's clear from what we've heard that digital fragmentation really does pose complex challenges for businesses. They need to adapt to new regulation, rising protectionist measures, and of course we mustn't forget this is against the backdrop of continued technological change. We've only just touched on automation and artificial intelligence, and so it is an extraordinarily complicated environment. So what I thought we would do now is explore some of these issues a little further, and I want to do that through a panel discussion. Let me introduce the 4 speakers we have on stage. Armen Ovanesov, Principal Director, Accenture Research. Hosuk Lee Makiyama, Director of European Centre for International Political Economy. John Mayton, Chief Data Officer, HSBC. And Richard Cumbley, Global Head, Technology, Media and Telecommunications and Intellectual Property Practice at Linklaters. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our panellists to the stage. Jeff, thanks very much for joining us. Clearly much to get through. Armen, let me start with you. What do businesses really need to understand here? We've outlined regulation, technological change, protectionism, but what are the key things they really need to get?
Well, thank you, Michael. Well, firstly, thank you for organising this fantastic event. I think what's been particularly interesting for me is the blend of policy and business and developing and emerging markets and developed markets together. I think from the conversations that I've been hearing around just this morning, something that's really struck me is how this big context can be misinterpreted. And I'm going back to what Omar said at the beginning about the 2 large trends. So on one hand, you have accelerating global digital business. On the other hand, you have these increasing national legislation. What this isn't is a collision of business and government. Right? So it's a collision of trends, but it's not a collision of, and I think it's in fact the opposite, which is a call for greater conversation and dialogue between the two. And I think that's become really clear, and it's great to hear those messages across this different group. Because when you think about how these things play out in reality, so if you think perhaps a few years ahead when you do have autonomous vehicles, as you say, and you may be driving between your country of where you live and where you work, perhaps across a border, might be France, Belgium, Germany, perhaps Ireland, Northern Ireland, and perhaps that automated car will stop at the border, right? And that may have been because a piece of legislation had to be accelerated because of some incident, and so the company decides to switch off the piece of tech that allows that data about that citizen to cross the border. And that's all perfectly plausible, right? Well, the technology's there, the legislation, these things are happening. And no one wants that. The government wouldn't be happy with that. The driver or passenger certainly wouldn't be happy with that. The car company, the insurance companies, no one wants that to happen. So actually there's a very strong shared agenda in all of this. So I think that's the thing that we're at the beginning of. All these trends that we're talking about, whether it's the Internet of Things, where you'll see even more data moving across borders and between devices and people, means that we need that dialogue to happen that much quicker. So that's outside the company. Inside the company, the range of issues that have come up are incredible. If you think of, even on the physical side, if you think about the infrastructure, the fact that, as a company you may need to invest in more data centers in more countries, which also means more IT talent in those countries, which is scarce and expensive. And you're talking about the need to be more flexible with those data infrastructures. You don't want to have those centralized, rigid infrastructures. So you need more redundancy. You need to allow for more flexibility, more decentralization, which is possibly where infrastructure is moving anyway in the conversations you hear from the experts on networks. We understand that the issue of latency means the speed at which data needs to really move to allow artificial intelligence, virtual reality, augmented reality, all these technologies may require us to have data centers far closer to one another, so within 100 kilometers. So that's an entire upheaval of our current way we kind of have our infrastructure at the local level. So that's the physical side of things. And then all the way to the other side, you have the most intangible of things like brand, right? And brand as we heard earlier, has to become that much more local, right? We're understanding more and more how everything is about relevance in this world. The smartphone in your pocket, everything has to be relevant. That means that it has to be local. And so even at that kind of very intangible level, we're seeing how younger digital companies, newer digital companies are starting to realize that that vision of a smooth, boundaryless digital world it may be an ambition, but actually the reality is that we do have national boundaries. And what the Minister said earlier, that actually rules have to be created, legislation has to be created at a national level. And so there is no getting around that. So it's about, issues as wide-ranging as the real physical stuff, capital expenditures, etc., all the way to kind of the intangibles. And then also, if you think about the strategic, all the way down to the operational. So if you think about the strategic issues we've already talked about today, like the international footprint, your presence in different markets, that companies are really seriously thinking about leaving markets, entering new markets, very strategic decisions. And also their digital vision has to be that more understanding that this digital journey is a complex one. It's not a simple one, and that they do need to cooperate with outside stakeholders, and they do need to plan in a very different way, all the way down to trickling down to the operational issues. So that's really about what we call an operating model. So your organizational structures, your business processes, your people, all these things have to be far more agile, right? So if your external environment is changing, you need to internally respond to those changes. And some of those changes may be easier than others. We already saw that 51% are already reorganizing their global IT structures. Those are more processes and physical things. The harder things to change are the people things, right? The things related to people and culture. And the truth is, with cybersecurity, data privacy, these things, a lot of those issues come up. So huge, wide-ranging things, from physical to intangible, from strategic to operational.
You're talking about comprehensive, fundamental reorganization, rethinking of a business model for lots of industries. So it is, we're talking about a huge task here. Richard, let me turn to you. Legal impediments, that's clearly a big part of this puzzle. New legislation that's coming through, how that may or may not impede free flow of data and therefore force changes of business model. What are the new laws laws that businesses need to look out for, and really, how much do they matter?
So, well, thank you, Michael, and thank you everyone for coming along today. This is an area where Europe has been astonishingly successful in exporting its worldview. It would be great if maybe Europe was more successful in exporting some other things as well. We've been great at exporting regulation and law, and here's one of our great success stories. We talk about impediments. We're really talking about impediments in the areas of privacy, cybersecurity, and national security. Those are really the three areas where you see this cropping up most. Then there are some sectoral rules as well, but those are the three big areas. And when we talk about barriers, as the Accenture report does, we're talking about hurdles rather than prohibitions. Very rarely are national governments saying, thou shalt not send out from my borders. There are some areas around national security where that's not the case. But mainly we're talking about impediments, grit in the oyster of free trade. And the biggest problem for our clients is that grit is not consistent. So that even if you look at the high watermarks of these data prohibitions, the Chinese cybersecurity law, for example, data localization in Russia, the GDPR, the way that grit manifests itself differs. So in China, under the cybersecurity law, you can get around that prohibition if you do a security review. We don't quite know what that yet is, but it's going to be a thing, right? We know that in Russia you can get around the data localization law if you have consent from individuals and data is kept inside the jurisdiction of copy. And the GDPR, we've got a load of sophisticated ways of getting around that prohibition. But those differences make compliance costly for business. And that, I think, is the key issue that comes out of the Accenture report. It's not that there is prohibition, it's that there is cost and grit. That maybe is the first thing. The second thing to think about is why these things exist. It's very easy to say, well, look, free trade is a good thing, it enhances the economies of the world as a whole, average incomes grow, why would you possibly get in the way of free trade? But there are good public policy reasons that generate this grit.
and those public policy reasons are national security, a response to a digitalisation of a business that removes jobs from a local area. And we see this really acutely in the UK. We've had a big debate here about investigatory powers. What power should government have to intercept communications here in the UK? So on the one hand, we've heard Matt Hancock talking about free trade, sharing data with Europe, but almost in the same breath, the UK government is saying, well, look, hold on, I need to be able to get access to technology companies' communications in order to ensure security of my citizens, an entirely justifiable aim of government. In order to achieve that, data either needs to be in the jurisdiction or I need to get access to it from the jurisdiction. So that's a public policy aim that bangs right up against that free trade aim. And there are others we can talk about, response to jobs and those kinds of things as well as we go along.
Okay. Hersuk, what can policymakers do? Because it's complex. They don't want to stop trade, they don't want to stop business, but there's a demand, a need for regulation, and clearly a need for trying to standardise this. How do policymakers rise to this challenge?
Well, I would say the response has been very ambiguous, because where there is grit, there is a cost, not only for business, but also for entire economies. If you look at the data localization measures and privacy measures that we've seen rising over the years, for example, for the UK and Europe, the cost for the economy could be up to 1.1% of GDP. And if you consider that an average finance minister or treasurer would cut off both his arms for 0.1% growth, that's quite a big number. And privacy means compliance. And compliance also entails cost. And I do agree that there is what we call conditional flow. Data cannot flow in and out, and you have to fulfill certain kind of conditions. And these conditions are extremely expensive, especially if you're an SME. And what we have seen in the recent years is that these conditions are strict and they're also very national, which means that they go against the whole idea of how internet operates, or actually how multinational business operates. You don't want to have a business operational software installed in every one of your country. You don't want to have HR software. You don't want to do accounting in every one of the countries based on national system. You want the whole idea of multinational business is to actually to scale. Essentially, what we have seen now is that most, unfortunately, jurisdictions have said, you can't scale. We actually don't like the idea of foreigners processing the data of our consumers. So, for example, if you would have a tailor in Thailand now and building a very simple register of their customers that they are trading with here in Europe, most likely that register is illegal. And now, if there is a cost up to 0.3% of GDP based on privacy, that is likely not going to happen. Let me explain. It creates, if you have a law which essentially you can go after any company to be in breach of privacy laws of UK and Europe, you're going to be selective in your enforcement. Most likely, these 0.3% will not materialize because you will not go after every news agent or tailor. You will go after a company who rhymes with noodle or who are named after major rivers in South America. Essentially, you're going to basically pick your targets and pick your enemies. So the problem here is that we have seen a major element of industrial policy and protectionism. And digitalization is a major challenge, not just for the UK and Europe, but also a number of Asian countries. And while we have seen protectionism in the past, in the 70s as well as in the 90s and all the way back to the 30s, this is a very new kind of protectionism because it's actually about fundamental rights. It's actually about national security with trying to secure uncontrollable law. Certain extent, for example, if you look at fiscal policy, it's a question about, well, essentially about who has the right to earn money in your economy. And these things are very often very difficult to tackle in a trade negotiation. So what we have seen now to date is that we have essentially two models. Those who say we want to actually remove that grit and remove that friction as far as possible, because we don't like self-imposed sanctions. We don't believe in them, and finance ministers like growth. And the best example that we've seen, I think, is TPP. TPP 11, which used to be 12, but United States unfortunately have abdicated from an agreement, which contains real proportionate safeguard, and say you can have privacy laws, you can have taxation laws, but just make sure that they are least trade restrictive. If there are any better ways to impose a regulation, do it. Don't just shut off the data. And the second approach is to make sure that they are not actually, the second criteria that you have in TPP is that they can't really be disguised protectionism. And I think that makes a lot of sense. The other model is the adequacy model that we have heard about several times now, is that a country decides who is adequate, who is not. And data can only flow with countries that are deemed adequate. Who are they? Very few. Adequate usually means essentially equivalent. And if you're going to have an adequacy decision, it actually means that you're going to have some kind of negotiation. And when two governments negotiate, whether that's free trade agreement or whether it's adequacy, there need to be symbolic concessions. Even you are essentially equivalent. For example, I'll take the example of Japan, which has actually, in many respects, better privacy law than the UK and the EU. But we will still demand concession from Japan in order to recognize this as adequate. And the second problem here is that these kind of decisions take a very long time, and they tend to be subject to industrial as well as populist pressure. That means, for example, to date, UK and the EU has only acknowledged, a handful of countries. No one in Europe. No one in Asia. Just to recognize the name of these hives. If I'm going to be generous, I think the only country in the Asia-Pacific region that is included is New Zealand, and which represent about 0.1% of our trade. So essentially, we haven't covered the big economies, and we'll probably never be able to cover countries like China. We are close with Japan, and at the same time, the free trade agreements that we are signing now, aside from TPP, are essentially blank when it comes to the e-commerce chapter. We recognize this, our ministers recognize this is the most important part of our economy, the most dynamic part which will increase the productivity. I heard some comment from a lady from the Airbus talking about the productivity factor. Yes, this is the number one factor why UK productivity is lagging. It's about digitalization. We are slow in digitalization. We want to fix this. Still, zero blank page in the trade agreements. It makes no sense. And the problem with this approach, of the unilateral approach, is that we can't address data localization measures because they go beyond privacy. They ask you to localize company data, financial data, sectoral information. It could be employee data, production data. So we need to go further. And when we don't do that, if we fail to do that in trade agreements, what actually that entails is that all the liberalization we have achieved so far in the World Trade Organization, bilateral negotiations. I've been in international trade for 20 years. I did trade before Brexit. And now everything that we have achieved is going to just be thrown away simply because before you couldn't actually restrict access to professional services or manufacturing industrial machineries. But essentially, by government cutting off the data, you can turn a smartphone or an industrial machinery into the world's most expensive piece of brick. You can turn a consultant into the least productive employee of the economy just by cutting off the data. So all the market access we have negotiated over the years can be cut off. 56% of all international trade depends on access to data. So the government can actually shut off that trade at any moment just by making slightly less profitable.
So it's actually quite a bleak and concerning outlook there, John. Let me turn to you. You're Chief Data Officer of HSBC. You operate in multiple, you're a global bank, a huge amount of data. How are you navigating this changing? How's HSBC managing in this changing regulatory environment?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me here and to everybody in the audience. We operate across multiple jurisdictions, and we have been for quite a few years, in fact. What I will say is that the ability to share information across jurisdictions has been incredibly helpful to us in a number of different ways. It's allowed us to build centres of excellence where we can concentrate training and systems development. People have mentioned beforehand about the fact you do want to build IT systems in lots of different locations and maintain them, etc. So that's really helped us in a lot of extents. I mean, we are also kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place in some extents as well, in the sense that some of the regulators which have a global reach, say the United States of America, would expect us to really understand our customer base from a global perspective, and that's very difficult to do if you can't share the data. So they would very much expect that we risk rate a customer that holds an account with HSBC in London exactly the same if they also held an account in Hong Kong. And it's very difficult if we can't share that data. Same as if we actually identify that somebody's been doing some nefarious activities in one jurisdiction, but they hold multiple accounts with HSBC, we should automatically curtail that account in other locations as well. So the restrictions on data sharing do actually hamper the requirements that the regulators want us to operate as a global bank. And we are constantly trying to work out how we can do that. I think one of the mistakes that's often made, though, is that people talk about data, and it's a very short word, and it means everything. You can share an awful lot of data without actually compromising restrictions. Do you need to know the person's name to actually do analysis on patterns of payments? You don't. I mean, and once you've found an adverse pattern, you can actually go back to country and say, we've seen this, tie it back locally to the persons that's done that pattern of trading, and prosecute them or do whatever you need to do locally in country. So I think it's important to actually separate the bits which you aren't allowed to do against the bits that clearly you are allowed to do. I think there's also an additional challenge which is coming up as well, which is once we bring all of this data together, it's the opportunity of a local government to change their regulations. So, if a country, I can't imagine of one at the moment, but decides that they're going to step out of a collective jurisdiction and change their rules and maybe share that data with the United States of America, how would other countries that are currently sharing their data into that jurisdiction going to feel about that? And does that mean that we also have to build agility into our models so that we can move that data quite rapidly somewhere else to make sure that we're still compliant with the countries that are sharing the data with us? There's also something as well, which is that the data sharing agreements as well, we find are also can be selective as well. So, we have sharing agreements with certain jurisdictions where we can only use it for financial crime purposes, and we can't use it for, things like looking at demographics of, the population of our customers, etc. We would clearly like to be able to use data in a lot of different ways. I mean, you talk about trade. One of the things which would be really neat for us is to understand if we've got a buyer on one side and a seller on the other side of the world, but are both with HSBC, can we actually link them up from a financial perspective as opposed to having letters of credits in place? So it's challenging, but I think we've got a pretty good handle on what we're doing on data sharing.
You must be spending a lot of time, and HSBC must be constantly looking at changing regulations, where to place data centres, what data can and can't be used. Because you also have technology changing as you're going along, and consumer trends changing as well.
Yes, and it's quite and you have to look at everything from a nebulous point of view. So, a change in a regulation in one country where you're not actually sharing data directly with, but let's say you've got a follow the sun type of support environment, somebody's able to log in with super user access to support a system somewhere else in the globe. That means that they've got access to the data. That means that you are effectively sharing the data there as well. So it's not the obvious things always that you have to take into consideration. So we have to map everywhere where our data is, what the purpose of that data is, and make sure that we get confirmation on a continuous basis about, you know, whether or not the regulations are changing, or whether or not the need for that data has expired, or you know, people want to change what they're using that data for.
Okay. I mean, you mentioned earlier that there was, in a sense, an alignment between business and government policy makers working together, but it sounds like harmonisation of some of these regulatory changes is the key. I'm not aware of a forum where that is even being discussed. So how does one adapt to that?
Absolutely, and to add to that, I think it's just the beginning. We're at the beginning of a very long journey. When I was talking to the minister earlier, we were talking about the speed of change and how quickly everything is changing. Well, and earlier we were talking about regulations catching up with business. Well, when we think about what's going to happen in terms of the Internet of Things and the sheer volume of data that's going to be having to move between devices and between people, between machines, etc., it's going to only become even more extreme. So I think one way to think about this is, there's kind of push and pull places where government and business can come together. We mentioned earlier things like lobbying and places where business can go through industry organisations. We talked about the digitalisation of industry event a couple of days ago here. So that's industry going to government, or places like the G20, which has a B20 organisation for the businesses, for example. But then there's the other side, which is the pull. So for me, the big question is, how can businesses and innovators help engage with government to help shape the next wave of digital growth? And that, to me, is a question with all these words about collaboration, etc. It's still not clear about where are the right people who really understand these new technologies, the next technologies. Yeah. When do they get to sit down with the government people to figure out the legislation that's going to be happening? As far as I'm aware, that doesn't happen.
Yes, yeah. I mean, that's a piece of work that possibly, clearly should be happening, but very difficult to answer those questions. Richard, again, the dialogue between business and government on policy shifts in an environment where technology is changing rapidly and policies are already way behind the curve. Are you satisfied that enough dialogue is happening? Is it happening in the right place with the right people?
So let's talk a little bit about the speed of legislation. Because one of the things that governments have done over the last 20 years is respond to the speed of change in their economies by reaching for the one hammer they have in their toolbox, which is law.
Yeah.
So if you look at this country, since the war, on average, up until about the year 2000, we issued about 2,500 pieces of legislation a year, primary and statutory instrument. Since 2000, that's gone up by about a third. We now issue on average 3,500 pieces of legislation. And not only do we do more law, but we do longer law. So if I look in my area, technology, the GDPR, which Matt Hancock talked about at the beginning of the day, that is 3 times as long as the piece of legislation it replaces. Now that, as an environment in which to act, is very, very difficult for business. More legislation, longer legislation, and often not even time for the old law to stabilise before you regulate again. That is a very unstable environment to think about business decisions. So one of the first things I would be saying to ministers everywhere is, before you reach for that hammer in your toolbox, just maybe stop and wait. Wait and see what happens. And maybe just take some time before you reach for your hammer.
Are you getting that response of government?
So I don't want to so we are issuing a report next week on the rule of law, on precisely that point, which will come out in a minute, talking about the pace of legislation and what good law looks like. I don't want to trail that. It's not my show, but that is coming in a minute.
Terrific. By the way, very happy to take questions from the audience. Please, if you would like to get engaged, please do. We'll start now. Over there, please.
Thank you. My name is Mark Brand. I'm from ThoughtWorks. We deal with some of the data issues you've pointed out. I particularly like John and Richard's points. So talking about being able to map and track data with some agility and reconfigure how we treat and move our data is obviously critical globally. irrespective of the pace of the regulatory environment, but it's becoming more important because of the speed and heaviness of regulation. If we took GDPR as an example, the requirements for GDPR are actually quite basic, and in the landscape, certainly I've seen, the corporate response has tended to be to adopt a kind of protection layer approach, not the thorough mapping, tracking, agility that you've described, and to respond to the regulation, to your point, that's happened now, as if regulatory innovation is not likely to happen over 5 or 10 years. So candidly, there's an iceberg of lack of composition and ability to deal with, in the spirit and letter of the law, data well in this or any other jurisdiction. And it doesn't appear from maybe some of what we heard today, say earlier today, or elsewhere, there's much dialogue about helping businesses get on the front foot to being effective in both the spirit and letter of the law and composed well to deal with all the challenges that you've mentioned. Are you seeing any instances where people are taking that on as a competitive advantage and thinking about that strategically? And if not, do you think you're in a position to help your organizations and clients do those things?
Maybe I can add some colour to that. Excellent question. One of the points which was made earlier on was about the fact that these things come along and the difficulty about actually adopting them. I think GDPR is actually one of those regulations. I'd spent 5 years in Germany, so it's very similar to German regulation there. The interesting thing is that the Germans do this very well on a day-to-day basis. I mean, they don't have a problem with it. They have data protection officers, etc. We find it difficult just because it's new in this environment. What I think will happen with GDPR is that technology companies will fill the vacuum that there is at the moment. So whereas at the moment people have not historically been mapping their data, it will become kind of just part of the process. So I think we'll look back in 2-3 years' time and think, what was all the fuss about? And I think the point about that is that once you've done that, it then gives you so much better control over your data. One of the things which I really want to see develop as well is one of the biggest challenges that we have is actually sharing data with teams. So a team will come along and say, I want to see this data, and the typical answer is no, which isn't particularly helpful because it doesn't allow them to do their job. Really, the question should be, why and what level of data do you want to see, and be able to put an abstraction layer that sits on top of the data so that they only see the bits of information which they need to see. Now, if you can do that, if we can build something like that, then it will give the organisation an agility to actually share the bits of data which are important enough for them to do their job, but not sufficient to break any regulations. And by doing that, we actually uncork the bottle of data to an entire organisation. So actually doing GDPR is going to help us in the longer term by forcing us to put those sort of solutions in place that actually will then enable us. Because before GDPR, if you asked to see customer data, the answer was always no.
So there's a technical solution, and it's more about data management as you see it. So what data can be extracted off given teams and meet compliance.
I mean, I think there's a wider understanding also in the the world of business that actually data is an incredibly valuable asset. I mean, I think somebody gave me an example the other day where they said that the data held by the company was worth more than the actual product that the company was selling. And that's very much what I see, talking to senior people inside HSBC as well, that they really do see that this is a valuable asset that we have, and we should be investing in data as opposed to investing in technology which allows us to do trading or sell, whatever loans or whatever other type of products. Because by having huge amount of data that we have, it just gives us the opportunity to leverage our business, like we've never really done in the past.
Hey, how's it?
Well, I agree on GDPR that there is a certain amount of confidence building exercise, and also if there was a great deal of regulatory divergence within Europe before, and making that interoperable, basically one law, one-stop shop. There is a great harmonization, but the problem is, how do we do with Asia? And that's the real challenge. The question that was raised before about where is the forum? Well, we are not part of APEC, and frankly, the APEC framework on privacy will not work for us, because our standard is, it's not necessarily higher if you ask an Asian, but it is certainly different in our regulatory approach. And I think the key problem here is the hammer that Richard is talking about. And in many cases, there are no, I mean, you regulate when there is a market failure and there is a need for corrective measure. In many cases, there aren't. GDPR is a question that many people ask themselves, where is the market failure? But you see other regulations that are coming out now, for example, e-privacy regulation, which will essentially disable the entire internet advertising market, because we prefer paid content rather than free content in Europe, and therefore we want to impose that business model, and that's really challenging. You talked about the intermediation between buyers and sellers that HTTP would be able to fill. And the question is, would that be considered to be, one, legal in all the jurisdictions? Second, where will it be taxed? There is now, going back to the forum question, OECD has decided it's okay to double tax internet platforms. It's the only industry that will be actually exposed to double taxation. Why? Because they don't have a permanent address. So where are you going to tax them? The key thing is that everyone pays taxes. Accountants, internet platforms, Starbucks, they all pay taxes in their home jurisdiction. We only have problem with foreigners not paying taxes in the UK. We never ever think about the fact that we don't pay a dime in taxes in Asia. And that's really not a problem. And this is going to change. And when platforms are going to be taxed, double taxed, basically they won't be profitable. And the question is, will that market mediation, this innovation, will it really take place here in the UK?
It's a very brilliant point, and I think they connect to this idea of, well, when does the hammer come out? And the hammer usually comes out in reaction to events, right? And that's the difference between these big long-term trends and events that happen every now and then. And it is a real friction that's going to keep going between these trends. We did a sentiment analysis of the media, so we looked at thousands of media articles over time around the world, and we saw a real how those friction, like tectonic plates, can actually result in tremors every now and then, right? So the second half of 2016 saw a bunch of tremors. And so the hammers come out when there's tremors. So we saw that the media sentiment towards terms like globalization really shifted. So it's kind of fluctuating, and then it just dips at the end of globalization and becomes negative. Pretty much a mirror image of that was the sentiment towards nationalism, which was negative, fluctuating, and then actually came into the positive at the end of 2016. And the sentiment towards the word multinational was very interesting. Not only did it fall, it fell to levels below the entire global financial crisis. So you get these moments, and I think it's important to think about, well, when does the hammer come out, and think about when do you get those frictions, which is why that dialogue isn't a once in a while thing. We have to kind of keep that going and look out that it's not coming out just as a reaction to events.
Yeah. But is it, Richard, you see this, that you know, we've had a rise in nationalism, we've had populist voting, we've had some extraordinary shifts in global politics, Brexit, Trump and the like. Is it that mood, that background, which is also driving rapid adoption of legislation that might otherwise have taken more time and thought?
Yeah, that hammer is coming down for all sorts of public policy reasons. It's not just because of a failure of a market. We've talked about government access, that's not a market failure. Privacy is a fundamental right in Europe, that's not a market failure. We apparently have chosen that on a democratic basis. The area which is going to be really difficult over the next 20 or 30 years is process automation, artificial intelligence, robotization of jobs, the displacement of labour. The displacement of labour will make it very hard for governments not to respond with some form of localisation, domesticisation, tax-based measures. Finding some other way of responding to that challenge in a public policy forum that doesn't involve saying, come work here or else, is going to be really important over the next 20, 25 years.
Okay. Richard, I'm afraid that it's already happened. There's now a legal proposal to ban companies to engage in text-based data mining. It's a copyright law.
Sorry,
There is a copyright law legal proposal that will make it illegal for companies to engage in text-based data mining, looking at public information online and build algorithms.
Okay, I have another question from the audience. So.
Hi, I'm Oliver Yaros from Mayer Brown. I have a question about, we've spoken quite a lot about how differences in regional and country-specific regulation may affect the established players. To what extent do we think that these differences may in fact entrench some of the advantages that the established players have that operate on a globalized basis? So if we look at the big banks and other members of the financial sector, they're already, very large, well-regulated organizations. They're used to responding to regulatory change. So for them, privacy is another regulatory change project. But obviously, for the unregulated business sector, the SME sector, that perhaps, as you said, haven't had to address this kind of data mapping, data governance requirement before, do we think that is actually going to prevent them from being able to innovate to the same extent that they might have been able to in the past to compete with the big players?
Choke off innovation because the big players have systems and horsepower and lawyers to deal with it, and the smaller players don't.
We've also got some very old systems as well, compared to the agility that others have got. Actually, I mean, I think that, in a vacuum, that things will be developed to overcome that. I mean, I can very much see the legal, firms, etc., just giving portals to say, right, I want to expand my business into this particular jurisdiction. You answer a few questions, and they'll tell you, all of the things that you have to consider actually when you're, doing that. I think that, as far as things like, when you're doing that and you're sharing data between one jurisdiction and another, IT companies will provide solutions where you can actually map that and keep it maintained and link it also to regulation. So if the regulation changes, you wake up in the morning and in your inbox there will be a red letter which says, watch out, this is coming in 6 months' time, and you've now got to change the process that you've got. I think that the only advantage that we've had as a huge company is the fact that we've got all of those lawyers and intellect in-house, and it's just a question of federating that and making it available to other people. And it's a great business opportunity, I think, for some consultancy or to make that sort of toolkit available.
We were talking to the Minister earlier. I was talking to the Minister earlier about potential for Thailand to leapfrog some other country because it is getting at this level, and the e-business, the e-government component might actually be mechanisms through which small medium businesses, which is one of your focuses, can be alerted to regulatory changes and possibly be engaged. Is that the way you're seeing it? That is it a disadvantage to smaller businesses, these changes, these frictions, or is it
It's a mixture of these. And what's interesting is, for a long time, everyone's been talking about small companies disrupting large companies. Well, actually, this is one of the instances where actually a lot of young, small digital players have had to catch up. They haven't really been ready for what I'd say is back to that concept of digital vision, that concept that there are no boundaries and everything's this beautiful, rosy digital world. And actually now they are coming to realize that can come to bite them, and part of that is the perception and not engaging sufficiently with the local operating environment and being seen as a global player, a foreign player, and not a local player. And so I think a lot of the more established firms, especially including tech firms, have really gone through that cycle, even in technology. 10, 15 years ago, the big players went through that and realized, no, we need to be hyper-local in every single one of our markets. We need to show that we are part of the national innovation agenda, that we are part of this, we understand the strategic priorities of the country, whether that includes lobbying, etc., and real commitment. It's real commitment, and then also to be seen to be doing it as well. I remember I lived in India about 10 years ago when the country was really booming, and you saw at that time the local companies really taking a real pride in their growth. And actually, what was a global, people who saw global brands as a very positive thing before, actually it became a slight disadvantage because the local brands were a real symbol of the country's growth and a symbol of the development of the country. And so the global brands had to learn how to explain to the local market and to the government, etc., how they were committed to that local market. So you're seeing that now happening everywhere.
Right. No, it's actually quite interesting because 25 years ago when I studied economics and international trade, the common wisdom then was that only multinational companies can trade across borders because it's a pretty damn expensive activity to engage in. You need to have sales offices, you need to have the manpower, you need to have the corporate infrastructure. Now what we have is something we call micro-multinationals. We have multinational companies run by single owners in Sub-Saharan. They are making fantastic textile products in Kenya, which is all through Alibaba and other platforms, Etsy, and you can endless list of them. So international trade, which used to be a big players game, is now available for everyone. And there are two learnings from this, I think, that is extremely important, is that if you put regulatory barriers or regulatory divergences in place, what will actually happen is that it becomes a big players game again. If you look at, for example, GDPR, the 4 legal mechanisms that you can utilize in order to take data across countries to serve your customers, essentially 3 of them, I would say, is exclusively reserved for multinational with an army of lawyers and endless, bottomless turnover that they can just basically take this the overhead cost and just basically spread it thin. Unless you don't have the turnover, it will be extremely unprofitable for majority of SMEs. The second is what's the regulator's role in market concentration? What internet has actually created is also a much more fluid and much more dynamic market space. So our concept about what is actually market dominance has really changed. So, traditionally in the US as well as Europe, is that we don't actually have any problem with dominant companies. We have problems with abuse of dominance. That's 2 different things. But something that I have learned is that, very few people saw the amazing tectonic shift that we would see from internet and all the wonderful innovation that would come. And many people who saw that were business consultants, but very few of them were competition lawyers or trade negotiators. Let's agree on that. And if you look at the cases we have done, for example, in the US and Europe, for example, 15 years ago, again, Microsoft, because there was a bundling of Windows Media Player. If you look at those rulings in hindsight, because we believe that Microsoft will be dominant forever. And if you look at what we actually asked Microsoft to do, did that help Apple to launch its iPod? Did that help Spotify from Stockholm, my hometown, from literally a bedsit, a 20x-year-old guy basically disrupted the entire music scene? And no, none of these competition cases actually help neither Apple nor Spotify to enforce a paradigm shift. And so, once again, we have to think about competition in a completely different way. And competition lawyers talk about it as a dynamic competition rather than static one. Essentially, it's not going to be a competition between companies necessarily. It's a chain of dominances that will replace each other. So, yeah.
Richard, to you, small businesses, SMEs, disadvantaged by this new regulation because they don't have the guns and the lawyers to deal with them?
So one of the big pushes that the UK tried to make in the negotiation of the GDPR was that there should be a blanket exemption for SMEs. Effectively, they should be taken out of that area of legislation. Because in Europe we regard privacy as a fundamental right, that removal didn't succeed. And as a result, we legislate more or less, not quite, but more or less on an even playing field, small and large. We'll find out how much that impedes European startups. the European tech sector isn't quite as successful as that in the west coast of the States. So maybe there's something there.
Okay.
Maybe there's something there. It's not an overcomable barrier. We have plenty of startups. We've just been talking about one that started in a bedsit in Stockholm that has gone on to achieve very significant success. And actually there's an organisation that challenged copyright law, but actually has taken a really very successful approach in relation to privacy and data transfer almost from day one. So that it is possible to be a startup and think about these issues early stage, particularly if you swim in the ecosystem. But there are marginal gains here and marginal gains being lost. So I do worry that maybe regulating everyone will turn out not to be such a smart choice.
Final word to you, Ahmad. Are we expecting more or less innovation? Is the regulatory track and all these complexities that you've outlined so comprehensively in your report, is it going to choke off?
Well, and that's precisely the point. I think, we all want privacy, we all want security, we all want fair competition, but we also want that to happen without impinging on the growth and innovation. I think what we're trying to do with this is to highlight that the conversation hasn't been happening. The conversation has been hijacked by headlines in the media because of the political nature of a lot of these topics. And yeah, that's interesting and it's exciting, but it actually has meant that we don't hear the very real and in-depth and important conversations that need to happen. And I think everyone, as I say, there's a lot more in common than people necessarily realise, because people like to talk about the divisive aspects of it, but actually we need to understand which parts are common, and the point is to achieve those objectives, security, privacy, etc., and still encourage growth and innovation. That's precisely the thing we're trying to bring about with this conversation.
Thank you very much. Well, we're very pleased to be part of the conversation. We're very happy that you were here as part of the conversation, and we will continue it going forward. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid we have to conclude it now. Thank you very much for being here at Asia House today. My thanks also to those who are watching us on our stream programme. Thanks to Accenture for the report. Great thanks to the Minister for rushing here from Heathrow through London traffic to get here to speak to us. Also, thank you to my speakers, Aman Avanesov, Hirsukhli Makiyama, John Mayton and Richard Cumbly. And finally, thank you all for being here. We'll see you very soon. Take care.